Lawmakers worked until the very end of the 2024 session came to a close, passing about 20% of the entire term's legislation just between Monday into Tuesday morning. So the flurry of bills to land on Governor Healey's desk in the wee morning hours of January 2nd included some deeply complex legislation, like a long-awaited hospital industry oversight bill. But there are also dozens of hyper-local initiatives in the pile. So while the governor takes her constitutionally guaranteed 10 days to decide whether to sign, veto, or pocket veto those bills, let's turn our eyes to 2025. I'm Jennifer Smith, and this is the Codcast, Commonwealth Beacon's podcast about policy and civic life here in Massachusetts. We're starting off the year with a mini Massachusetts roundtable, talking to leaders in very different areas about what they'd like to see the state tackle in the next year. This is an audio medium, of course, so let's introduce everyone one by one. Salem Mayor Dominick Pangallo, hello.
Hi, thanks for having me on. Looking forward to the discussion.
Jessica Collins, Executive Director of the Public Health Institute of Western Massachusetts. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you. Thank you so much for having me.
And Brad Campbell, President and CEO of the Conservation Law Foundation. Welcome.
Good morning. Happy New Year to you and all of your listeners.
So let's look back to look forward. We just made it through a marathon last leg of legislative session. Mountains of bills, some big issues to tackle, including healthcare. So let's start with you, Jessica. What did the state get right this last term, and what did they leave on the table?
Well, we are so grateful for our Western Mass delegation, always looking out for our regional equity issue in the 4 counties of Western Mass. We definitely had some very exciting transportation issues, healthcare, of course, primary care still very much needing to fix primary care. So I think there was a lot of effort, but we still are really, really struggling as a service shortage area in Western Massachusetts.
Brad, climate initiatives and energy policy have also swamped the year. In late November, which seems wrong now that I think about it, but it was pretty late, the governor signed a sweeping climate bill into law. So how has Beacon Hill done on CLF priorities last year?
I think the climate bill coming through was a great way to end the year, but it was painful getting there. And we had a lot of leadership in the legislature, but some impasse, and the administration more focused really on some of the permitting reforms, which we strongly supported, less focused on some of the things we need to decarbonize our energy system. And so it's in that sort of a mixed bag in that sense. And in terms of what the administration can do without the legislature, we really haven't seen the kind of bold leadership that I think we'll need, especially with the arrival of a second Trump administration. Great leaders, at DPU, Commissioner Rubin, Chairman Van Nostrand, pushing things forward on energy. But there are so many other tools in the administration toolbox that they can use without an additional climate bill or to implement the climate bill just passed that I think are going to be more important in the coming year.
And Mayor Pangallo, Salem sits at the intersection of a number of municipal identities. It's a gateway city. It's a famous North Coast town. It was one of the first places to be in compliance with the MBTA community's multifamily housing law, if I remember correctly. Your former boss, Kim Driscoll, was your mayoral predecessor. So what did Salem want from the legislature or the governor or the state this year? Did you get it?
I think we saw a lot of positive progress on things that are critical for us here in Salem. I think the affordability and livability of our community is our priority and our foremost concern. And we saw positive work done with the Affordable Homes Act, with the first iteration of the Municipal Empowerment Act, even the climate bill. It meant a lot to us as a community that's contending with the impacts of the climate crisis, whether it's forest fires or collapsing seawalls. We're seeing it on a daily basis. So decarbonization and sustainability is critically important for us, but it also having the investments in the resilient infrastructure is really, really important. But the Affordable Homes Act was huge, not just for Salem, but for all of Massachusetts. There were elements that didn't make it through in the final version that, similar to the Municipal Empowerment Act, that I think would have given cities and towns a little bit more ability to raise revenues independent of the legislature to take on the work that we need to do at the local level. But on the whole, both of those packages of legislation were really significant in meeting the challenges that we have as a community.
I'm curious a little bit about the relationship between your groups and you and state leaders over the last year. So I think I'll start with Jessica and Brad, and whoever wants to go first can go first here. Did this feel like a normal cycle, given that so many major bills were pushed through past the usual sort of drop dead deadline in the summer? Was it easier or harder to keep track of possible policy changes, given the deluge?
Well, it's harder in the sense that once they're past formal session, everything becomes much more opaque in terms of the status of negotiations, where different language is being tweaked, and so forth. So it's a much more difficult terrain to navigate, and the outcomes become that much more uncertain. And I think you saw that in particular with the natural gas provisions being in the climate bill, and then an effort to sort of cherry pick the permitting provisions and put them in an economic development bill. All of those movements really occurred after, or predominantly after, the formal session. And so they're much more out of public view, but even for advocacy groups like ours, it does become more opaque, harder to track, and harder to catch any concerns that the final legislative language may present.
I would say from our perspective, again, from Western Massachusetts, the relationships that we have with our Western Mass legislators is very special. And so as much as Brad's saying things do become more opaque, I think that we were very happy with the things that were passed. We felt like we were able to advocate from a regional perspective on certain things. Some things were included but not funded, which we were disappointed in, but actually we feel like that helps with some, momentum moving forward. So we are grateful for the leadership, and we recognize that there's more work to be done.
Yeah, we're going to get into a few of kind of the ongoing policy areas that we expect to pick up in this next year. Mayor Pangallo, it's a well-known oddness, I suppose, of Massachusetts that cities and towns often have to ask for state sign-off on a whole host of policy initiatives. So from zoning to liquor licenses to tax adjustments to revenue generation. And I was poking through some home rules to see what Salem had asked for over the past few years or so. And so a few years ago, they had to get the legislature to agree that the city could change the number of members on its local board of health. Changing a condo conversion policy also needs, the legislature to agree to it. So what's the process been like advocating for Salem in the last year and basically just this chunk of your first term?
I would be lying if I didn't say it's very frustrating sometimes to have to go through a legislative process for something like setting the number of members on a local board, or asking for the ability to have another liquor license for a restaurant that wants to open up in our community. I understand the reasoning behind a lot of the process, and the need to have that kind of legislative role, but it is pretty frustrating, and it introduces a lot of uncertainty into our own planning when we think about what our priorities are. We just prepared our first package of materials for the first city council meeting of the year, and included in that is a request for a home rule petition for automated enforcement of speeding violations in school zones, which will be the third session that we've submitted this bill. It was originated by my predecessor, the now Lieutenant Governor here. And I'm not sure it's going to go anywhere, but I really want to make sure that it's clear that we think it's important and we're going to keep asking for it. I mean, this is how we got forward traction with the legislation around video enforcement for school bus stop arm passing. We had to demonstrate through a pilot program that it was a problem. It was a significant problem in Peabody and here in Salem as well. So I think, if we make the case to the legislature, it can take a process sometimes. It can take asking a few times. We have strong partners in our legislative delegation here out of Salem in Senator Lovely and Representative Cruz, and they've been great advocates for us. So we'll engage in that process, but it can be a real frustration, particularly around the resource generation. You mentioned the revenues and our ability. We're maxed out in terms of our meals excise and our lodging excise, but our costs are going up. We're not immune from inflation and from all the rising costs of healthcare and capital costs and personnel costs. And so we're really constrained in our ability to have the resources to meet those costs, to have the community that we think we should be.
So for the rest of this time, let's focus on the year to come. We're talking on January 3rd for everyone listening, and everyone is shaking off the holiday, gearing up for a new year. So could you tell me all, starting with Jessica, a policy area, either specifics or a theme, that you'd like to see state lawmakers dig into expeditiously, sort of the first thing that you hope that they tackle?
Well, again, I will mention the fact that Western Mass is a service shortage area and for a lot of healthcare issues, and that has to continue to be a focus. It absolutely has to. We are very excited about one of our big policy efforts called the Clean Slate Initiative, which really is a workforce development, but also a justice policy, which is basically addressing criminal records for people who have served their time. They want to get a job, they want to be productive citizens, et cetera, get housing. And so that is a major effort of ours that came out of a health impact assessment that we did here in Springfield a few years ago. And then last, I think transportation and climate go hand in hand for us. They have to be seen as multi-sectoral challenges, and we are working with statewide and regional coalitions to address policy issues. For example, working with Brad's group, and we're lucky enough to receive an EPA grant, which will go after some local municipal policies.
What about you, Brad?
Yeah, I would echo the importance of solving the riddle of transportation funding. And we tend to focus around Boston on the T, but it's really a statewide issue and a regional challenge. And it's important, as Jessica said, for health, it's important for justice, it's important for economic development, it's important for clean air and health in the neighborhoods most burdened historically by pollution. But oh yeah, by the way, it's also addressing our most significant climate challenge, since transportation is the biggest source of climate damaging emissions. So I think tackling that, the magnitude of the political challenge is such that it really is going to require leadership, both from the legislature and from the Healy administration, because it is a tough challenge. We saw in New York how challenging it was with the continuing battle really over congestion pricing. But you also saw in that case, after some fits and starts, Governor Hochul, who's not especially known for being out front on issues, her actually taking it on and moving forward with congestion pricing. Not that that'll be the solution necessarily, but I do think this is something both legislators and the governor are going to have to take on heads on, because it's been kicked down the road so many times that now is the time for leadership.
Yeah, it does occur to me. Healy, I believe, recently said, her top priorities in the new term are transportation and housing, which of course is interconnected with literally everything that all three of you deal with all the time. So, Mayor, you mentioned a few home rules, some initiatives that you're hoping get taken up. What's top of the list?
I mean, housing is still a critical issue for us. We need to right size our housing supply, and we're doing all that we can to advance the projects and the policies to get that done. Brad mentioned the climate impacts and certainly the sustainability work that's ongoing. We're still trying to advance the offshore wind terminal project in Salem that we think will be transformational. It was the site of one of the dirtiest coal plants in America, and now it's going to be the second offshore wind port, marshaling the turbines that we need for a clean energy future. But I would say that one of the other top priorities for us right now as a community is our public education system. Salem has a thriving public school district. I'm proud to be the chair of our school committee and a public school parent myself, but there's some problems in the Chapter 70 formula that I think the legislature needs to address. And I know that there's an interest in wanting to wait for the Student Opportunity Act to be finished, but it's really urgent and it can't wait. In FY23, Salem was the only gateway city to receive minimum aid. Most gateway cities received an average of 13% increase in their Chapter 70 allocation. We received about a 0.5% increase. There was a flaw in the system. We've never caught up. And so we're still paying for that. We're still paying for that shortfall. And more gateway cities are going to kind of fall into those gaps. So I think there's a lot of work to be done around education. The promise for pre-K programs for gateway cities is really, really meaningful. We are proud to be a model program in our pre-K partnership in Salem that the state's now using for other communities. And we hope there's funding that's going to come with that, because it's expensive, but we feel it's important for giving our kids a strong start and investing in the families that are important for our economic well-being. So there's a lot around education that I feel it's really critical for the future of our Commonwealth, and I'm hoping the legislature is ready to roll up its sleeves and get to work on that as well.
And Jessica and Brad, you both mentioned a few things that are kind of continuing priority areas that you're pushing for year over year. Jessica, could you elaborate on that a little bit? What are you hoping might get picked up again by the legislature? And then Brad will talk about what other tools are available and who might pick up those batons.
Yeah, well, thing I didn't mention, but I will pick up on the mayor's comment is around youth mental health, which does go along with some legislation had been put forth but didn't pass around youth mental health in schools. And I think that that absolutely needs to be a focus, and it needs to be funded and connected again to other sectors to support families. So I did want to mention that one.
All right, Brad, what do you want them to go back to?
Going back to some of the mayor's themes, I think the challenges on adaptation and resilience to the climate impacts we can no longer avoid should remain front and center. And that's something that both the legislature and the administration have a role in. There's certainly areas where policies and rules can be changed to facilitate those projects in ways that currently they face a number of barriers. I know in the city of Boston, and on their efforts to address floodways, have run into regulatory barriers or agency barriers that the administration could do a better job at sweeping away. But there's also a significant finance component. How we finance adaptation and make sure that all communities are protected is something, number one, that we haven't fully figured out as a Commonwealth, but also I think one where we need to start showing some real progress in changes on the ground and getting some resilience and adaptation projects moving. And I think the contrast there is the rulemaking process has been hung up around, for example, the question of whether we're going to continue to allow building in the so-called VE zone, the most climate vulnerable zone. And that should be an easy question at this point, given what we know about climate. And yet it's still one of those changes that has not readily been integrated into the regulatory system.
And Mayor, I've got a little bit of a twist on that question because it can sometimes be useful to peel back the curtain a little bit when we talk about initiatives that sort of take multiple cycles that have been asked for multiple times. How do you try to stay abreast of particular priorities once they cross into that sort of legislative Beacon Hill arena? Because it can be something of a last minute reveal if a real estate transfer tax or some other change is just left off to the side, which we don't know until the final solution comes out. So thinking about what initiatives you've been watching year over year, and then how Salem tries to either pursue certain initiatives or pivot if it seems like the legislature just has no appetite for something.
I don't like to be pessimistic about anything, but we kind of presume that if it's going to the legislative process, it's probably not going to happen, but we're going to hope that it does. And so, planning for the worst and hoping for the best, I guess. Like I mentioned, we have a great team in our legislative delegation, and we have state partners that are, in other agencies that are able to kind of keep us abreast. It is a bit of a black box, which is a bit of a frustration, but we see things like the Municipal Modernization Act, now the Municipal Empowerment Act, and hopefully that's coming back for a second round to take on some of the things that didn't get across the finish line. There's work to be done around centralized utility evaluations, and there's some issues with tax title. All of it is really small potatoes and wonkish, but it makes a big difference for a city and town. Like, it ties up millions of dollars in a city that has a $200 million budget. It's a significant impact to our ability to deliver services, to compensate employees, to take care of the projects that we want to get done. There's been a lot of push around those kinds of reforms. We try to stay abreast of what's happening. We're fortunate to have partners like the Mass Mayors Association, the MMA, MAPC, and all of these organizations that are advocating on behalf of us. But at the end of the day, our legislators are our partners, and we try to rely on them to advocate for what I think we feel the community needs.
And if you each had to pick something that felt like the long shot, the thing that you would love to see happen, but is something that you either expect to take many, many more cycles or has not really generated as much buzz as you think it should, or something like that, what is your shoot the moon, either area of focus or a specific policy, if there's one that really directly comes to mind?
Well, I would say long-term, figuring out state algorithms so that communities don't get paid per capita, but get paid for resources that we all really need. I would love to see that happen in Massachusetts.
All right, Brad?
I think navigating the finance issues associated both with climate and with adaptation and resilience is is really the moonshot that people need to start working on. It may not get resolved in a single legislative session, but we have in the transition away from fossil fuels, there are a lot of unanswered questions. There are a lot of additional solutions we need. Not all of the costs of that transition can be put on the bills of, the electric bills of businesses and families. And so I think focusing on those issues, understanding some of the constraints and addressing the full range of constituencies that are affected, from environmental and climate advocates like us to organized labor, those are, I think, critical to our continuing the kind of progress that we've made on climate and that you see, as the mayor described it, in places like Salem. And that's actually something I think the administration and the legislature have done well, but could do more on, which is highlighting really the opportunities of the energy transition as much as some of the challenges. We have the largest heat pump in the country being installed just across the Charles River in Cambridge for one of the largest commercial scale decarbonization projects. We have low carbon cement startup in Holyoke, Mass, and across the board, and obviously with the offshore wind as well. There are nascent industries that are going to be important to the transition, but also important to Massachusetts maintaining a strong competitive position economically. And the more progress we can make on those sometimes in the weeds, nuts and bolts issues about how we're going to block and tackle the energy transition, I think the more that the opportunity side of that equation be apparent both to the public and people considering investing in Massachusetts.
Mayor, is there a long shot for you? Often what ends up happening for municipalities is, as you notice, these kind of fiddly things that might sort of seem like small beans if you're looking at the entire state, but often there's like this niggling issue that just never actually gets addressed. Is something falling into either of those categories?
I mean, I think in terms of a very specific long shot, we've long asked as cities and towns for a Massachusetts School Building Authority style agency for municipal buildings. In 2026, Salem celebrates our 400th birthday, and we have the infrastructure to show for it. It's expensive to maintain a city of our age, and having a state agency that partners with us, similar to the MSBA with schools, for our municipal buildings would be huge. But I would say, like, if there's a really big long shot, it's local. It's just more local autonomy. Whether it's excise taxes, our ability to negotiate with cannabis companies. Massachusetts is one of 13 states across the country that doesn't have a local sales tax. Give us the tools to be able to think about how we're going to invest in our communities and let us make those investments. And I think that's how, we would get to the place where we're a community that works better for everyone and where we're more livable and affordable for the people who live here now.
And I think the last question is something that we've sort of alluded to and danced around a little bit, which is the federal landscape and how that factors into this. The thing I hear most often from policy folks in these sorts of conversations is some version of, oh, at least Massachusetts is shoring up X, Y, or Z. So if there's anything that comes to mind, where do you want Massachusetts to potentially align with or push back on some of the things that we might expect from the next Trump administration? Because could be either.
First of all, there's so much has been threatened. I think that the biggest concern, and obviously one that affects all of us, is the undermining of democratic norms and the rule of law that has been at least threatened or invoked. That's a concern for all of us that I think the administration and the attorney general will be active in pushing against. But beyond that, I think it's really important for the Commonwealth to set a positive course of its own, working with other states in the region. We have 5 out of 6 New England states, New Hampshire being the outlier, that have strong climate mandates in place. As a region, we can demonstrate a successful energy transition, or at least progress on that transition, in ways that no other multi-state region in the country can or will. Focusing on that, focusing on the affirmative things we can do, is the best answer to whatever bad policies come out of the Trump administration. And we need to pursue that not as a matter of quote unquote resistance, but as a matter of solving problems and meeting the challenge that we've already taken on as a Commonwealth in terms of committing to a clean energy transition. There isn't a lot that I think that we'll see from the Trump administration to help But I do think that we can keep progress moving, and that much of that progress is going to be hard for the Trump administration to hinder or stop.
One thing that came to mind on my side was at least offshore wind has been a huge discussion about how that's going to end up looking under the next administration. Is that one of the things turning around in your head?
Yeah, I think as far as the offshore wind industry goes, the next 4 years are going to be a challenge, but we're thinking about the next 40 years. This is a generational opportunity for us to really change the direction of our nation's energy systems. And that I don't believe is going to, it may be slowed, but I don't know that it's going to necessarily be stopped. So I'm going to remain optimistic about that. We're still pushing forward with our port project here. Definitely with the change in administration in Washington, concerned about all the funding opportunities that we've been fortunate enough to benefit from the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure and Jobs Act, and even just our regular formula grants. We're going through an exercise where we're mapping all of our federal funding and trying to identify what would be the impact if we lost this stream. Who would have to lose their job if we lost this stream? What kind of program or service in our schools or our council on aging would we have to give up? Again, it's part of planning for the worst, but hoping for the best. Really, I think the greatest impact that we're feeling right now, Salem is a place that strives to welcome everyone. We're a very inclusive community. Our values are directly inspired by our history as a place with our own past. And we're hoping that our state will be a partner in that spirit, because a lot of our vulnerable neighbors are facing a lot of fear right now. And we want to make sure they know that their local and their state leaders are here for them and here with them.
Okay, Jessica, we started with you. You get the last word, which is public health is no small factor here as we're looking forward to the next 4 years. What do you want the state to do?
Yeah, I really want to follow up on the mayor's point about continuing to lead with a social justice focus. In Western Mass, we are a decreasing population. We need new people who are coming here to take and fill jobs and add to our vibrant communities. And so I am grateful that Governor Healy and our state will continue to try to lead, like I said, with social justice and protect our neighbors and educate ourselves about knowing our rights and making sure that everyone's here to thrive.
Okay, that's all the time we have this week for our little mini panel. Thank you all so much for being here, and a Happy New Year to everybody.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Thank you to Mayor Dominick Pangallo, Jessica Collins, and Brad Campbell for joining me again on the podcast. Thank you for listening. I'm Jennifer Smith. Our producer is Claire Wigglesworth. Leave a rating and review wherever you're hearing this now if you want to help other folks find us, and email codcast@commonwealthbeacon.org if you ever want to get in touch directly. We'll be back next week.